I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I've been so looking forward to this interview with Hisham Matar. His new novel is My Friends. It's his first in a minute, but you know his byline, obviously, from the New Yorker piece back in 2013. He went to Libya to look into his father's disappearance. It became a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Return. And part of the conversation we're going to have today is about The Return as well as My Friends, because as I was reading My Friends, Hisham, I kept going back to moments in The Return, which I had not read in a minute. So I was quite pleased that all of this was surfacing as I read your new novel. But you are, of course, writing about exile and fathers and friendship and memory and all of the things I love to read in your work. So I'm very happy to see you today.
I'm delighted to see you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this. But I was describing My Friends as glorious to a colleague last night. I was like, no, you don't understand. I read it in a single setting. We're in London. We're in Paris a little bit. It's present day. It follows a friendship of three men over 21 years. And it's dedicated to your former publisher, Susan Camell, who died not that long ago. But I do want to start with Susan, actually, because you and I share her in common. I miss her every day. I really do. But the dedication of the book is to her. And her memory helped you write it. And I'd like to start there if you don't mind.
Susan was a very special person in my life. She was my publisher, but she was also my friend. And she did something for me that no one else did. Very lucky. I have some wonderful colleagues, editors, and publishers. And I'm lucky also because I've been working pretty much with the same people right from the start, which I know is very unusual. But Susan did something that is very difficult to describe because she edited me some. It wasn't so much that. It was more that she attended to my soul. So I remember, for example, after my first book, In the Country of Men, was published, I went with my wife Diana to this island that we love in Italy. It was basically heaven, you know. My book. Finally, I'm a published author, and the book's not quite out yet. And it was that gap. And I went there, and I went to start also on my second book, Anatomy of Disappearance. And of course, you know, things weren't happening. I was still tired from the first book, and I was naive. I thought I'll just like get cracking on with the second book straight away. And I was sitting in a square feeling quite low and starting to doubt myself. You know, maybe I'm a one book wonder. Maybe this dream is finished now. And just at that moment, Susan calls me. I don't know how, I forget how she had my number there, but she called me out of the blue. And I kid you not, she exactly said the following thing. She said, "Darling, what's the matter?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I just felt like there's something wrong. What's going on?" So I told her. And she said, "I don't think you realize how much that book has taken out of you and how much you need to rest. Just have a great time. You know, go to the sea, have fun, in the evenings binge on Sex and the City." You know, so she was one of those old-fashioned publishers who really knew how to attend to the soul of the writer, not only the page. And she always had a sense that the novel I will write after the return is going to be something quite special. And for that reason, she signed it without knowing anything about it. She said, "I don't even want a synopsis." That faith carried me through somehow. It was with me when things got a bit tricky with the book, as it always happens, of course. You lose your way, try to find your way through. And I felt that her presence, her memory, you know, and that wonderful smile of hers and that incredible laugh, and that way that she always made me feel that, you know, I had it, whatever it was, I had it. And, you know, it gave me great confidence and strength. So I do owe her a lot. Yeah.
This is also your longest book by
Yeah.
far, too. It's almost twice as long as you usually write. And
Yeah.
it flew. The chapters are short. We cover a great expanse of time. I loved these characters. But I really did feel like My Friends is in conversation with The Return in a way that made me feel like My Friends is possibly your most personal novel to date. I mean, you've taken pieces of your experience and put them into the earlier novels. Certainly your debut, which was also shortlisted for the Man Booker, which is now back to being the Booker, but that's a nice nod to get for a debut. But this book feels different, my friends. Can we talk about that for a second?
Yes, I mean, as you say that, I think of something that this wonderful writer who I'm honored to call a friend, but somebody that I admired for a long time, called David Malouf, an Australian writer, wonderful artist, really. And he told me once that after sort of 3 or 4 books, he felt that his work had dug a groove, and his choices were pretty much decided by this groove. He wanted to deepen and advance it, but he didn't feel like he could go in a completely different direction. And I wasn't sure I agreed with him that was, I mean, I agreed with him that that was his story, of course, but I wasn't sure that was going to be mine. But I do feel that there is a relationship between these books, that each book is somehow makes the next one a little bit more possible, I think. So I feel they're all related, and I feel they're all very, very personal to me. But my friends, I suppose what's unusual about it is that it is a book about contemporaries. All my work, the first 3 books, In the Country of Men, Anatomy of Disappearance, The Return, were books about the aftermath, living in the aftermath of certain events. The most common thing, being begotten. That I often walk around the street sometimes in certain moods, and I look around and I think everyone came in that way. And it's a complicated way to be in the world, right? It's rich but complicated. I think those books are thinking about that question. A Month in Siena is touched by that, but it's turning. It's turning, facing forward. And I think My Friends is very much a book about contemporaries. Of course, contemporaries who are haunted by the past as well, but it's very much about the relationship of contemporaries. And so maybe if I wanted to make an argument for it being the most personal, I don't know if it's the most personal, but if it is the most personal, then it might be because it relates to the present a bit more sharply for me, a bit more.
Partially to Khaled, our narrator. He makes a home in London. He comes to Edinburgh as a university student. He ends up in London and ends up finishing his education there. I'm staying away from spoilers because this is going to air. We're taping a little bit in advance, but this is going to air the week the book comes out, and I really want people to be able to experience the novel the way I did. But he has sort of an unsteady relationship with London, and he ends up living in the same apartment for 40 years, which he is not planning. He's very reserved. Readers will find out some of the reason behind that. But he also has a complicated relationship with London. And I'd sort of like to start there because, this is not your typical, I don't want to say immigrant narrative, but, there is sort of a thread, whether it's in the UK or the United States, where it's like you come and suddenly, the world opens up and you sort of immediately want to be, I don't know if assimilated is the word I want to use, but you understand where I'm going with
Yeah,
this.
yeah, I do.
I do want to talk about Khaled because he is a great character. And he's also a little funny without knowing he's funny because he's constantly saying, well, I just lied. I just lied. I just lied.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's that also, I mean, obviously, I just found him fascinating, and still by the end of the book, I couldn't quite understand. I couldn't make up my mind. If one were to judge him, that's not necessarily the most interesting thing to do with a fictional character. But if one were to judge him, I wasn't sure, which side of the fence I'll come on. Whether his reluctance is a sign of bravery or the opposite. I wasn't sure. But it's his reluctance that I was very interested in. I'm fascinated by characters who are not sure about their relationships, the relationship to their place, to where they are. I've also witnessed that. I mean, there's something, there are those immigrants that feel such a profound need to demonstrate their belonging to a place. And those who are perhaps less sure, who are ambivalent about that. But I think that no matter what kind of experience an immigrant has, the relationship to the place that they've adopted, I've always liked that formulation when people say my adopted country, because the country is supposed to adopt you, but so, but also I think it tells you something that you are adopting the country as well. Whatever relationship it is, I think it's always hovering between those two. It's as if ambivalence is actually possibly the most difficult thing to achieve. And that's what I found interesting about him, is that he's not entirely ambivalent towards London. He has a very passionate relationship to it. But there were moments of ambivalence that I found very, very interesting. And of course, it's a bit odd what I'm doing because I'm writing about a fictional character that has a relationship to a city that I have an incredibly powerful relationship to. It's my home, it's where I live. And his relationship and mine, although there are moments of overlap, they're different, And I wondered as I was writing,
Yeah.
the differences are quite interesting because on some level, his relationship, I think, represents some of the things that I'm very frightened about,
Like what?
ending up alone in a city where you have no roots. That is the fear behind every immigrant.
Mm.
And it's also why we are actually pretty stable. All my friends think I'm this international person who's lived here and there, but actually, I've moved much less than most of my friends. I'm in the same, place where I'm talking to you from. I've lived here for a very long time, and the place before that was a long time. And a lot of my immigrant friends seem to have the same experience.
Here's the thing. I'm not saying that My Friends is autofiction, and I don't want listeners to get distracted. It's not autofiction.
Mm.
It feels very intimate, though, the way you tell us the story. The chapters are very short, which is something you've done before, but I think I don't want to say I'd forgotten it, but it's part of the propulsive nature of following this friendship of these three characters.
Mm.
And I kept turning pages because I needed to know what came next. And really, this is a novel about a long-term friendship. That's really, you have written a very nice novel about a long-term friendship. So it's not as if there are fireworks on every page. There's a lot of interiority. There's a lot of conversation about art and literature. At one point, Hisham, one of the friends, makes a literary map of the neighborhood that Khaled has moved into. And it's sort of T.S. Eliot lived here, and Virginia Woolf lived here, and Robert Louis Stevenson lived here, and not Joseph Conrad, but I'm missing one of the writers. But it was sort of
Conrad
this.
also, and Ford Maddox Ford.
Okay.
And
Oh, right. Okay.
Henry James. They're all about within a 2-mile radius of where I'm speaking to you from, which is the area where Khalid lives. But also, it's also a book that takes place. I mean, I think books are very important for it, but it's also a book that takes place at night. It's told on a nocturnal walk from the train station to Shepherd's Bush, this part of town. And I've always found, and obviously there's several books hovering, over this book, hovering over the characters, but also books that were useful to me, and thinking about. One of them, strangely, because in some ways they don't relate to each other at all, is or at least on a superficial level, is the Arabian Nights, because the Arabian Nights is also made up of these short chapters. And I found that relationship interesting between the miniature and the epic, in that book. That you've got all these miniature stories, but actually the bigger story is quite epic. There's a tone oftentimes to Shahrazad, the way she, those little bits in between the stories when she actually speaks her own intentions, when she asks for permission to tell the story, for example. Do I have your permission to tell you a story? It's one of the most radical questions, I think, in the history of literature, because when you ask that question, if you say yes, you have no idea what's going to happen. So the way that the story can have an effect on us can never be measured. So that was sort of in my mind a bit, all of that, and the walk, and all of this literary map that he's trying to cast on the city.
Joseph Conrad has always been a writer who's also been a touchstone for you. You've talked about Proust, but Proust, you can feel Proust sort of in the background the way Arabian Nights is in the background. The level of detail that just creating the epic out of these tiny, tiny moments
Mm.
of life. Robert Louis Stevenson, though, comes up quite a lot in this book for multiple characters. And I honestly, I have not thought about Treasure Island in a million years. And can we spend a minute with Robert Louis Stevenson? Because clearly he's someone you sort of walk around with in your
Gladly, yeah.
pocket.
I mean, I just think he's phenomenal. There's that wonderful book about this moment when it's an autobiographical book where he decided. There's a lot in Robert Louis Stevenson about exile and immigration. There's that very powerful scene in Kidnapped when they're in a ship, and the ship is moving close to the coast of one of the sort of Scottish highlands. They spot another ship, and they can't quite figure out if it's enemy or what kind of ship is it. And there's all that tension, and then when they come close, they can begin to hear the cries of the people on the ship. And
Mm.
then when they get closer still, they realize it's a ship of immigrants who are heading to the States, and they're saying their farewells. You know, and it's such a powerful scene. It comes out of nowhere in the book,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Okay.
And so Robert Louis Stevenson is one of those incredible writers that were very rooted in a place, but were fascinated by dislocation. And it touched his life very deeply, because he also, of course, then goes to America. He doesn't want to follow in the family business of building lighthouses. There were great lighthouse engineers, and he takes this ship to America. And on the way, he describes it as this the Iron Country. This ship becomes their Iron Country afloat on the sea. He had this romantic idea of what an immigrant is, young, hopeful, strong, brave, all of these things. But instead, he finds all these broken people on the ship, tired, ill, hopeless. But he is very important to my protagonist and to his friend. He's sort of their favorite writer. And he used to live in Shepherd's Bush, so they hold that very dear to them.
Jean Rees, too.
Yes.
It's been a while since I've seen anyone connect with her on the page the way you do. And it's through, obviously, Khaled. He has quite the connection to Jean Rees. And again, listening to you talk about Robert Louis Stevenson and dislocation and exile, it makes perfect sense. I mean, Wide Sargasso Sea is still a book that I love and I still pass around. But after leaving Mr. Mackenzie, like the sort of the quartet of novels that she did, when you think about dislocation and exile, like, those are quite great examples. But you've described yourself in other interviews as a failed poet, that you write novels because you couldn't get off the ground, as it were, as a poet.
I mean, in my very early days, I mean, I suppose I was trying to find my way. I didn't know what I had these three ambitions. I wanted to be a musician, then I wanted to be an architect, and I wanted to be a poet. I didn't have no gift to be, or discipline, whatever it is, to be a musician. I did become an architect. I was all right. I wasn't I wasn't terribly talented. I was okay, competent, I would say. And I only thought of literature as poetry. I don't know. I think because when I was a kid, that's all I read. So I thought of literature as poetry. I didn't really get into novels until my early 20s, quite late on. So I think that's why. But right now, I just feel incredibly fortunate because I think the kind of books that I'm interested in writing, my friends, has in it a lot of what I love about architecture. Architecture is very interested, of course, in proportion and structure and rhythm. It's also interested, I mean, architecture is really not bricks and mortar at all. It's the volume, it's the emptiness. And and part of trying to write a book like my friends is to create the quality of silence around the book, in the book, that the reader can hopefully inhabit, and but also music. So I feel the three loves, poetry, music, and architecture, are somehow, I feel like I'm exercising my passion for them, at least on some level. Yeah.
And having read my friends. Yeah, I can see all of the ways that the different arts flow in to the book that we ultimately get to read. I think the pacing is masterful. I think there are times when you're trying to chart a decades-long relationship, and you sort of alluded to this at the start of the interview. You were like, "Well, I got into the weeds a little bit," without quite saying I got into the weeds a little bit. But when you sat down to start My Friends, did you start with Khaled, or did you know that it needed to be sort of this triptych of young men and you needed to be able to touch toe in London and Paris and Libya as well? I mean, let's talk about the structure for a second because it is kind of perfect.
Thank you. I mean, this is a book that emerged very, very slowly. You know, it took a very long time. It came very, very slowly. So, the first ever, I thought, the first time that I thought of the idea
Mhm.
was in 2011 with the Arab Spring.
Oh,
I thought, wouldn't it
okay.
be interesting? Because I was so close to lots of people who were involved, not only in Libya, but in Egypt and in Tunisia. And I thought one of the things that is fascinating about what's going on is that human temperament has such a big say in what and how people behave. It's
Right.
not only political ideology or your ethics, whatever it is, you know, your devotion to democracy or otherwise. There's also a question of human temperament. And I thought the novel is a great place for the human temperament, right? It's a hard thing to talk about in any situation, but the novel I think is very good at it. And I wrote a story about these three friends um, in a cafe that doesn't exist anymore on Holland Park Avenue called Cyrano, which is in the book. They meet in
Right.
that.
Okay.
So I wrote a short story about the three of them in the cafe. And I didn't really know much more about them, but I couldn't get the short story out of my head. And I would, from time to time, hear one of them say something. So I would write it down until I ended up with sort of 150 pages of these sort of that felt like slides. You know, it would be an image, it would be a sound, it would be an exchange. Sometimes I don't know who said that to whom. Or
Mhm.
not long ago, I was going through some papers for something for a little show that I was doing at the British Museum around the return. So I was looking at all these scraps of papers that I'd kept from back then. And I
Mhm.
found an envelope from when we lived in Paris in 2003.
Okay.
And on the back of the envelope, there's an idea for a book, and it's just a couple of lines. And it's basically this book, you know, a book about male friendship. It's been emerging that way. But then when I sat down and started properly writing something that now resembles this book was in 2012. I wrote the opening of it, that first paragraph, and I thought, yes, I want the novel to start with a party, with a farewell, you know. And I didn't know why, and I didn't know where was he going, and why does this mean so much to them? I had no idea about any of these answers. And then so I stopped and wrote The Return and went back to it. And then I stopped and wrote A Month in Siena. It's been like
Mhm.
this. But I think now, from this perspective, I think I know the reason why it's taken so long,
Which is?
which is that subconsciously, I think I knew that the book has to deal with the events of the Arab Spring, because these characters are embroiled in one way or another in the relationship with Libyan politics. I also knew that it's too soon to write about it, that I needed some time to pass. I thought that I would need another 10 years, you know, but I was lucky, I think. I was lucky that I managed to cultivate that sort of, I think to write about something, it's a paradox. To write about it, for me at least, several things need to have matured, you know, a sense of kind of quiet, unspeakable passion, a passion that I have no words for. The paradox is that you don't actually have words when you start writing. At the same time, a sort of luxurious ambivalence about it, right? Some space, you know, that feels like space. It feels like an opening, and it feels the opposite of obligation. At least, you know, so I need those two opposing sort of forces to write it, and I just didn't know that I could have cultivated that sort of level of distance from the urgency of those events that I was myself very emotionally and circumstantially so embroiled in. I couldn't have written a book like this in 2012 or 2013.
Well, especially when I think about the events of the return and the way you tell that story.
Yeah.
Your father was a critic of Muammar Gaddafi.
Mm.
You were born in the States when he was posted to the UN, and he was kidnapped from Cairo by the Libyan government and imprisoned. The presumption is that he died in 1996, correct? I mean, you don't
Yes, we
technically
don't know
have
the
proof,
exact
but
date, but that's the most likely. That's the most
right.
likely.
So you go back to Libya for the first time in 33 years in 2012. You go with your mother and your wife.
Yeah.
And meet relatives. You had uncles and cousins who had been imprisoned for 21 years. Were your cousins imprisoned as long as your uncles?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so 21 years. And you have quite unpleasant dealings with one of the sons of Gaddafi, who was seen quite differently in the UK and apparently had tea at Buckingham Palace and things like that. Fascinating stuff. But I'm not sure when you say you could have written My Friends, it feels like there was a lot that you needed to do with the return before you could even really begin to sit with these characters specifically, with these men.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and it's a strange business this, because on some level you don't really. I think questions of choice over what it is that you're writing, are limited. Actually, I think you have a choice not to write it or to write it. It's not, at least for me, the choices aren't, do I write this or this or this? It's not like that. And I found a letter recently that I'd written to a very good friend of mine when I started writing that piece for the New Yorker, that then ended up being the opening of the time. And the letter is, I'd forgotten that I'd felt that way. You know, the letter was it was a panicked letter. I was saying to my friend, I think this is the worst possible thing I could do. I think
Right.
it's a big mistake, to write about this. And in a sense, I knew I had limited choice, and the book was taking me to exactly the places I didn't want to go. Not only taking me there, but taking me there in a certain way, because each book has, at least from my experience, each book has its own character, its own attitude, its own mode of moving and thinking. And the return had a very particular voice. It wanted to really hover patiently over the unbearable, and attend to it. So it wasn't only taking me to the unbearable, it wanted me to be excessively patient with it. And it showed me again and again that if I only could bear it, if I could bear to look at those things or think about those things, for example, if I could bear thinking about something that I've worked very hard not to think about, which is when my father was kidnapped and flown back to Libya and he was blindfolded, what was he thinking about in there? Did they take the blindfolds off? And if they did, what did he see out of the window if he was allowed to? All of these, endless questions. What did the cell smell like? And so on, all these things. What did it feel like? What did he think about? And the book really wanted, that's what the book was interested in. And I found that if I could just bear it, this incredible thing would happen. The material will start to flower, will start to produce all of these varieties. So, exactly the thing that was horrifying me and making me feel helpless and impotent became charged with the imagination. So, I had to actually imagine the possibilities of what might have happened on that airplane, you know. And it felt the opposite of impotence. It was a very strange exercise, that book. I also felt, and this is sort of, because in a sense there are two people in you. There's the person, the son, the man who's been through all of this, who's just thinking, "What? Are you kidding? That's what you want me to think about? I'm gonna go. I'd much rather go and sit by the beach." And there's the writer who has this kind of animalistic instinct, can smell it, can smell where the where the where the target is, you know. And that part of me was having a great time, was enlivened and uh, feeling, I would go to bed and can't wait to be up again in the morning to go back. So they had this very strange, almost schizophrenic sort of response to it. But the animalistic side, the writer, knew that it was on the other side of this book, some new register would be found, a new kind of playfulness, on the page, a bit more experimental, a bit more, playful. Yeah.
I think that's definitely what happened. There's also an element of sort of rage simmering below the narrative of the return for very obvious reasons. Because obviously you're working within a system that is not looking to help you find the information that you need. There are also lost records. I mean, it is just complicated from jump, let alone the emotional connection to a place that is it home in a way? I mean, do you feel like there's still a piece? You grew up in Benghazi and then spent time in Tripoli, or do I have it backwards? You grew up in Tripoli and spent time in Benghazi.
No, no, it was always Tripoli. I have a love affair with Benghazi, but Tripoli is where I grew up. It's a beautiful place. But I only really lived there between the ages of 3 and 8.5.
Okay, so you were
Any
very
no,
little.
any normal person would be over it by now. But it had such a profound effect on me, both for the obvious reasons, but also sensually. It's a very sensuous place. The light, the smells, and I had a very, very happy time there. I feel I am in a different place. I feel I am all the things that I was before, but I'm also in a different place. I have a slight bone to pick with a kind of myth, I think. It's a very well intentioned myth, which is the myth of self invention. I owe a lot to it. I think it's wonderful that we live in an age that we all feel we can self invent. I think it's great. But I also believe in the stain of history. I also believe that we have in us everything that has happened, and that's one of the things that is incredibly fascinating about this strange thing of being a human being. We have in us the memory of everything that has happened before us, but also, of course, us now. Yeah. But for me, questions of home now have become much more specific.
Okay.
They're actually quite simple, isn't the right word, but I think my home is literally this place. It's literally my bed and my desk, and my home is my wife and my friends and my family, and the tree outside of the window that now I've seen change over so many seasons. It's
Hmm.
these kind of very specific things. And I've noticed it's changed something. I mean, you might think this is silly, but it's changed something about the kind of existential reality, because I I'm usually, when I'm walking, very few people smile at me, right? They're not unkind, but they don't smile at me. And I've noticed over the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years, more people smile at me in the street. And I
Okay.
think it's connected to this. I think it's because they must feel on some level that I have surrendered, to the present. And maybe before they felt, oh, this guy's just passing through. Why smile? Why waste a smile on someone that's just passing through?
And that you're part of the place now. Yeah, I mean, London feels like its own character in my friends. I mean, we have a bit of a start in Edinburgh,
Yeah.
but London really does
Mm.
feel like it grounds all of and there's one friendship that sort of forms in Paris.
Yeah.
But London gives your characters space to roam in a way that I'm not sure they would have in New York. And certainly not in Los Angeles because, everyone's in a car in Los Angeles. But this idea that you can sort of meander and think, you have a lot of characters who are like, no, no, I'm not going to take the bus. I'm not going to take a cab. I'm not going to take the subway. I'm just going to walk for a bit. And
Yeah.
I do think that seeps through the storytelling, even when we're in a flashback piece or even when characters are revealed. There is sort of a languidness to the prose. It's very sort of like, well, here we are, and let's be here. And that was not my experience of reading The Return. And that was not my experience of reading In the Country of Men or Anatomy of a Disappearance. It is a really different voice for you in some ways.
Yes. No, I think you're right. There's a tiny bit of it in A Month in Siena. This in
Right.
only in the sense of wanting to be in it, sort of being contained by a place. I've always thought it was fascinating how, when you sit at home and you open a book and you are, if things light up between you and the book, you are transported and you feel as you're reading that you're moving, yet you're not moving at all. You're stationary. You're in the same place. So that very, very simple tension between those two has always fascinated me. Um, and I thought to have a book narrated on a walk as you are moving through a city can allow me some opportunity to mess a bit with this tension. But also that as you move into in a city, you realize that you are actually literally contained by it. That the cities that we live in are both the places that we make our home, but they're also the mentality. They are a mentality. And if we imagine a situation where there are no cities and somebody wants to make a case for them, it is exactly that, I think. And then for me, that is the most powerful case for a city. Of course, outside of all of the obvious important things to do with economics, and the city can become a kind of muscle. Becomes a consciousness, it becomes a mentality. And Khalid, my protagonist, doesn't claim for a minute to have captured that or had conquered it, in the way that, say, Frank Sinatra wished to conquer New York. That sort of feeling that we all feel when we are in a place. It's a lovely thing. He is he is he is actually quite committed to remaining a kind of shadow in it and using it as a resting place, which really to me I found so interesting, and also part of that sort of what frightens me. Like that also frightens me.
You give Khaled a line where he says, I've been trying to be at home in London for 3 decades, but London really wants classification. It really wants us to be, and I'm paraphrasing you, but that, we really need to have sort of names put on things and all this kind of thing. And here he is being, I don't want to say dreamy. Dreamy's not quite the word, but he moves through the world in a way that I'm not sure I've experienced with a fictional character before. He's of the world, but not. And I don't mean that in the sort of ghostly zombie sense, certainly, but he's a fascinating dude. That's the best way to describe him. He's just a fascinating dude. He's got one foot in and one foot out the door.
Yes, and we meet him at a particularly heightened moment of solitude. Where he's just said goodbye to his lifelong friend, or a friend that has been incredibly intimate, and who is now taking the train to Paris, and from Paris moving to San Francisco, and in a way that feels like a final parting, that they might never see each other again. And the other friend in the trio that they used to form, Mustafa, is gone back to Libya. And he thinks of them as one receding into the past and the other one moving into the future. And he sort of remains in the present, pretty much alone, with a few strong relationships, but pretty much alone. And the walk is where that opens up.
Mm-hmm.
All of that solitude opens up, and he wants to sort of um, it felt like a moment that can absorb everything. And we feel that. I mean, I feel that actually. That's why I think farewells are very interesting. That's why I wanted the novel to open up with a farewell. If you've ever taken somebody that you really love and can't bear to say goodbye to an airport, or train station, or their car, and they're driving off, And all of those emotions building up to it, where you really generally can't bear it. And then the moment they leave, something strange happens, a kind of opening, as if the moment expands in some way. And that's where we find him. And that's the moment that then absorbs everything that had happened in the past, but also absorbs for him. It's the moment where he can really take account of the quality of his presence in London, which is why he walks through it, taking detours through places that have meant something to them in the past. And for a while, I tested the novel. I tested it. I would I would say, well, what else can happen in that walk? Does anyone talk to him? You have an encounter with anyone, and it didn't work. A walk where he really doesn't speak to him. You and I think that's something else that happens in cities. I often leave my place, and I'd go take the bus, and I'd go across town, and I'd get off and I'd walk into the National Gallery, and I'd go and stand in front of a painting, having not spoken to anyone. I didn't need to explain myself to him. And so he travels those kind of journeys. Yeah.
It's really expansive, this novel. And we've got different kinds of fathers, and we've got different kinds of families, and we've got such a variety of humanity with such a tight cast. Even when you were taking me as the reader back in time to certain moments, I never felt like I had lost sight of where we were in the present. And that's really hard to do. It's really, really hard to do a flashback well, but also to not get lost in that moment and forget who's telling you the story or why they're telling you the
That's
story.
very interesting you should say that. It's very interesting you should say that, particularly in going back to what you said initially about the return. Because
Right?
that's a lesson the return, you write your books, but your books also write you in some way. They teach you things. And that book really taught me something about how to manage time, which is something I've always been interested in, because it's not in an abstract sense. It's just my experience. I think we all experience that. We are in a particular moment, yet sometimes some other door opens up and we remember something, and it sits right next to this moment and nudges it a bit. I've always been fascinated by that. And in the return, there were paragraph I remember that I sort of drew up, because they start in one moment in time, they go back, and then they end up in a completely different moment in time. And I wanted to do it in such a way that it felt effortless to the reader, And so that was a real masterclass of how to manage time. I felt I'm not, this is something I want to keep developing. And my friends definitely, it's a book that tells a history of about 3 decades told in 2 hours. The book actually only takes about 2 hours.
It did take me a minute longer than, but I'm not kidding when I say I
I don't,
read it
sorry,
in
I
a
don't, I
single
don't, I,
setting. Yeah.
no, sorry, I didn't mean it takes 2 hours to read. No, that would
No,
be.
no, no, no. I know the walk itself. I just want to be clear for listeners.
Yeah. No, I'm a very, very slow reader, if that's any concept.
I don't think I put it down from the first page. Actually, I know I didn't put it down from the first page, because at one point there were plans for dinner were being discussed, and I was just like, let me know what the plan is later. That's okay. I'll be.
Oh, that really touches me.
Right?
I think, part of what I was hoping to do is really have that sort of, transporting experience of reading a book and really forgetting time. I'm the recipient of that pleasure over and over, and I wanted to replicate it.
Time and interiority are the two things that the novel can deliver in a way that other art forms can't. Love the movies, television can be great, but if you're really going to sit with characters and play with time and really get into the heads of your characters, you need a novel to be able to do that. I mean, I love a short story. I do, but there is something really deeply satisfying about being able to sit with a novel, lose yourself in time, in space, in another person's story, and come out on the other side and just be like, that was great. I really want to do it again. Really want to do that
no, I
again.
agree. I agree with you. It also asks of you something else that is very unusual. It asks of you to be a co-writer.
Mhm.
You have to sort of fill in the gaps. If somebody's describing a building, you have to sort of help build it. The solitary art of writing is actually not solitary at all. It's very collaborative. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what I meant earlier on by the spaces. You know, creating the sort of spaces that are hospitable to another person's imagination. I think is part of what fascinates me about it.
It goes back to interiority. It goes back to time. Silence gets built out of those things, right? Or maybe we could say silence feeds the interiority and it feeds the sense of time. But I don't think you can separate those three things. Or at least in the novels that I love, I can't separate those three things. And I realized this was going to happen. We're getting close to markers of different kinds of time. Do you miss these characters now that you're sort of done with them?
No, I don't. I don't feel that because they're not real, right?
Yeah, no, I understand. No, I understand that
I-
completely. But they represent something for you.
And they do, and I feel sometimes I catch myself remembering a detail, but I don't just remember it the way you remember a fact. I remember it. I remember it emotionally. I feel, sometimes I pass a place, and I was walking with my mother the other day down a street where Khalid walks down, and something happens in that place. I felt I wanted to share it with her in the way as if I'm sharing something that actually did happen with someone, And then I stopped myself because I thought that's ridiculous. That's not going to mean it. That's like my character happened to be walking down here. So what? What's interesting about that? But I'm pausing because I don't want this to come across as being sort of I don't know, immodest or something. But the thing that I am just excited about is to have it sort of do its work, have it connect with readers. That to me is a pleasure that over the years and over the books has become really a genuine delight because the surprises that come up and the fact that you really feel the book becomes theirs, it's such a magical thing and feels like a huge gift. And so that's that. When I think of my friends, I think, I wonder what people will make of it. And I don't mean only, of course, it's important. I don't mean only reviewers and so on, but I mean in the quiet, silent rooms. I get from time to time I get letters from readers, and that opens a window into that, and it's just to me always a marvel. It's just always a marvel. I'm stunned that someone had read it, even though of course I know people have read it. I'm stunned.
I think that's one of the best things about reading, though, that we get to build this community, that we get to build and connect. I mean, going back to your architecture reference, yeah, maybe you were not the most inspired architect, but you do have to architect a novel, right? Like you do have to build a novel, you build a world, you build your characters. I'm not kidding when I say this book is glorious. It is so satisfying to read this book, and my friends just flies. And I think, exile is always going to be one of those subjects that people just never get tired of exploring. It's a really fundamental disruption, right?
And I think we all relate to it, even if we have the good grace of living in the same place, generations and generations. Because I think this moment particularly is a moment of great dislocation. I think a lot of us feel that we are being separated from nature, that we are being separated from a stable idea of a future. And I think also politically, the lines connecting the populace to government seem also to be very fragile and strained. And so I think I think it is a moment where we are thinking a lot about our relationship to the places and the societies that we inhabit. Wanting to create deeper connections, or yeah. So maybe that's one of the reasons why exile continues to be an abiding concern.
Oh, Hisham, that seems like a really great place to end, because exile is something that I think all of us contemplate more than maybe some of us might admit. We'll see. Anyway, I'm really excited for readers to get their hands on My Friends. Thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.